Narv joined the university in 2002. As I think many of you know, the university's Board of Trustees at that moment had set up an organization very similar to what some of our peers have. It's an investment organization that is set up as if, well, I think as if it were a separate corporation, in the sense that it has its own board, it has its own management, but it is part of the university for all purposes. They don't manage anyone's money other than Columbia University's money. Narv, let me change the question slightly for you, because obviously, as you sit as part of the university, but apart from it, the question for you really is, how have the markets changed? How does the world you're operating in today differ from the one you walked into in 2002?
Okay, well, thank you. I think, Robert, to take that question, I guess one might divide sort of the history of the way endowments have been managed into three phases. And anything sort of into the 1980s or before was a world of very traditional investment management for endowments. Portfolios dominated by maybe 70% equities, 30% bonds, in a very, what we might today consider a simple sense. And for those that were most adventurous, they might have some non-U.S. equities. By the time the 1990s rolled around, led by David Swensen of Yale, who I think has clearly established himself and his colleagues as among the best investors in the world, endowments began to change that model to a model of maybe defined by two basic premises. One, looking the world over for inefficiencies and how to exploit them. And secondly, looking for assets that were diversifying, that would provide attractive returns, but maybe behave somewhat differently than equities, allowing them to reduce their exposure to government bonds, which would traditionally be the lowest returns. And therefore, for many, many years, from the early 90s on, endowments in general produced very attractive returns and in some sense became the envy of the investment world, really until last year. And last year we saw a bit of a change in that. And I think it begs a lot of questions and some answers. A number of people have asked me, is the endowment model broken? Does it need to be fixed? And my answer is no and yes to that. I think no in a very simple sense. If we look at the last 5 years, the returns for Columbia's endowment have been actually 8%, 8.0 exactly. And if you compare that to the most traditional of all traditional portfolios, 75-25 S&P Lehman Ag, quarterly rebalanced, that generated negative 16 basis points. So let's call that zero. So in a simple and maybe even simplistic sense, it's hard to argue that there hasn't been value added from the endowment model. And to put that into dollars and cents that means something to all of us on this panel and hopefully means something to everyone here, 5 years ago, the endowment stood, or managed assets, which is the lion's share of the endowment which we manage, stood at $4.3 billion. At the end of fiscal 09, it stood at 5.7, with another $700 million being spent, or the net of spending and donations. So $2.1 billion difference for the endowment model, if you will. So I think that that was really helpful. But all of that should not lead us to stop thinking about, should lead us to not allow us to stop thinking about what could be better. And I think a couple of things are very clear. One is that endowments as a whole undervalued liquidity. We do invest in illiquid assets. We do so because they are attractive and can produce attractive returns. But as a general matter, I think endowments undervalued it. That's been in the press a lot. I think the one that hasn't been in the press a lot deals, or has not been there intelligently, deals with risk tolerance. And there's two parts to it. You see some press reports saying, well, endowments take too much risk. Let's step back for a minute. To defend endowments for a second, endowments have a tough equation. Universities spend 5% per year. A 3% assumption of long-term inflation, a 2% assumption of university inflation, you need to generate 10%. Susan and her colleagues, through their fine work, give us back about 2% a year into the endowment. You still need 8%. If you look at the long-run returns of equities since the Depression, they generate about 9%. And they've done nothing in the last 10 years. So in order to generate an attractive return for the university, we need to take risk, and we need to generate alpha. We need to do two things. So our backs are against the wall in some sense when we start. But I think universities in general, and this is not Columbia specific, have exacerbated that problem. There has been an excess, I think, whether driven by competitiveness among endowments, boards that I think in retrospect used bad judgment in citing that competitiveness, the media, and quite frankly, deans, faculty, and even alumni, all competing with each other as if it was a football game without two very basic facts. And comparing returns without a sense of what's the relative risk in various portfolios. And of course, no one can really have that full sense. And two, what's the appropriate risk level for each individual university based on its financial condition? And without those two things, I think that created an environment where there was no penalty for taking risk. Take risk because that'll produce long-term returns. And I think that's a real lesson here, that these peer comparisons, while interesting, are potentially very dangerous, and that people need to have a framework for thinking about risk. And as Robert knows, because he sits on my board, we've made plenty of mistakes ourselves over the years, plenty of them. But I think if we've done one thing correctly, it is making an effort from the early time that I was here in 03 and 04, working with the senior management of the university and our board to quantify the risk in the endowment and to parlay that into long-term scenarios of what could go wrong and relate that to the budget itself. And I think in many ways that guided us in our portfolio construction. Because in 2006, the question on the table from my board was, should we take more risk? Perfectly reasonable question to answer. Working with the board, working with Robert and his colleagues, we came to the conclusion no. And I think that helped us in a year like this, just as it may restrain our returns in the most ebullient and exciting of times as well. So I think that in many ways is the lesson of the current era.